afternoon, and welcome to a very special Miller Center conversation. My name is David Leblang. I'm a professor of politics and public policy and a faculty fellow here at the Miller Center. This is our first hybrid Zoom and in-person event in almost 2 years. So it's just exciting for us to be back in this space. And it's even more exciting because we're joined by Ricardo Zúniga, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Ricardo is an alum of the University of Virginia. He's somebody that we've been trying to get to come to grounds for, I don't know, probably 2 years or so, and just when we thought we had the opportunity to bring him to grounds, he left the Wilson Center and joined the Biden administration. And so we're just very excited to be able to have a conversation about U.S. policy towards the Northern Triangle of Central America and Mexico. We, as I said, have a combination of in-person audience, and those of you at home are watching through Zoom. When you have questions, please enter them in the I guess it's the Q&A box on your screen, and we will address those questions throughout our conversation and probably have an additional amount of time at the end to address specific questions that come in from both audiences. So welcome, Ricardo. Thank you for joining us. Before I get started with my questions, I was wondering if you have anything that you wanted to say just by way of introduction.
So, David, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's always a joy, and I can't tell you how much I wish I were doing this at the grounds instead of in Washington, D.C. But we are now used to this world, and we use this quite a bit. This mixed approach now is probably a part of diplomatic business for now and forever. But it is still very much an in-person business, as is talking about this in a real, having a good conversation is better when you're in person. So I'm sorry I can't be there for that, but I will be there. As I'd be delighted to be there and talk about other issues around the Americas in particular. I know you and I at an earlier time had a chance to talk about migration as an important phenomenon and the effects of not just Central American migration, but Venezuelan migration. And in fact, one of the things that really dominates our work here is the fact that we're seeing the largest irregular movement of people in the Americas. It's not even the United States that's the main destination for a lot of the people who are traveling. Most of it is within South America. But obviously, it's something that's important domestically in the United States. And it's enormously important in Central America because what it points to is a sustained instability and lack of opportunity that is motivating people to move internally, and then eventually, in many cases, to move externally to the United States or to Mexico or to other parts of the world. It's an important phenomenon, and it's not just the border, but all of the implications that it has. I also want to just say very quickly, this shouldn't really be primarily about migration because it really has to do with the way that people live and the way that people experience all of the factors that matter. Legal migration is something that gets buried here. It is something that we've emphasized. Legal pathways are very important for this administration because what they really point to is this deep interaction and the deep connection between the United States and Central America. These are very, very close societies. We are very close to Central America. What happens there really matters here. So I think that's the real story and something that merits a longer discussion.
So I want to dive into all of those. We want to talk about legal pathways. We want to talk about trade relations and economic relations. But before we dive into the specific issues, I want to get a sense of what your portfolio is. And I really want to think about this through the lens of your title, right? So your title is Special Envoy. And when I look at and for different people who might have that title, I don't see it very often. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the nature of your portfolio and why President Biden thought it was necessary to appoint somebody to this position. And I'll let you answer. We're going to try and deal with the echo we have in here.
Okay. So the first thing is that my title is very long because I have two roles. The special envoy was the one that I took on first almost exactly a year ago. And that was because as the administration came in and found that there was a lot of rebuilding that had to take place regarding policy in the region that had been entirely focused on migration. This was a policy, an administration that wanted to very much focus on a broader aperture. So issues related to security, certainly, but dealing with these root causes that were driving so many people to leave their countries. And there are multiple agencies and multiple offices in the Department of State that are involved in that. As we saw that this phenomenon of mass migration was growing, the administration decided that they wanted somebody who could help tie these various pieces together. They had another person who was housed at the White House. At that point, it was Roberta Jacobson, who was in charge of the southwest border. Mine is not a migration-focused role. Certainly, that's part of the story, but it really was an effort to develop and implement a strategy that would help us in a sustainable way deal with this phenomenon, primarily in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, related to governance problems, related to security issues, and more than anything related to the lack of economic and social development. The rest of my title, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, what I am responsible for is I am the deputy to the Assistant Secretary, who is the person who is in charge of U.S. policy for the State Department from Canada to Chile, all the Western Hemisphere. And as the deputy, that role encompasses Central America, but it's really the entire region. And my role is more helping the Bureau be organized and prepared to confront all of these policy challenges. It has some policy role in the rest of the region as well. But the policy leader for the Bureau is the Assistant Secretary, Brian Nichols, who I work for.
So let me ask you, I guess, a personal question, which is what drew you to this role? I mean, the portfolio sounds enormous, and certainly the politics of migration are fraught, regardless of how one approaches it. And so, what was compelling about the pitch that the president made to come in and work in this space?
So apologies for that phone. I will have to, pardon me 1 second. That's a phone I can't turn off, unfortunately. I would say, number one, that I have a long history in Central America. I was born in Honduras, originally from Tegucigalpa, came to the United States when I was 7. I've been in the Foreign Service for 29 years, but I've never worked in Central America. I've worked in other parts of the region. But as it happened, what really drew me to this work was that in between 2012 and 2015, I was President Obama's senior advisor for the Americas, and as part of that, we dealt with our first significant mass migration from Central America in some time. That was in 2014, and we developed a plan to try to contend with that migration then. And after that, I did something that was really unusual. The first time I'd had an opportunity to do this in my career, which was to go to the Wilson Center and write a kind of retrospective, do some work to see what we had done, what had worked, what hadn't worked, and effectively try to examine what could be done better if we were to try to do this again. And as it happened, we got a chance to do that again very quickly because, in fact, that instability never abated. Some elements of it got better, many of them did not. And so this was another chance to look at this in a more comprehensive way and bringing together various parts of the Department of State and other parts of the government to try again in a more basically in a posture that had a lot of support from Capitol Hill that we didn't have in 2014, and that had a lot of support from within the interagency and from the highest level. So this was a chance to try to do this again, using what we had learned about what had worked and what hadn't in 2014.
So given that background, so thinking about this through the lens of 2014, And in your introductory remarks, you used some at least in the academy, what we would think of as some buzzwords, right? So you talk about root causes, you talk about drivers. What the average person on the street sees is they see very high numbers of Hondurans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans, Mexicans arriving on the southern border. And in some cases, it's difficult for even for myself who studies this, like this is my full-time job studying it, it's hard to distinguish drivers that are motivating people to come through legal pathways, to come and claim asylum, and then people who come in irregular fashion and are apprehended. And so I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us an unfairly broad overview of from where you sit, what are the factors that are, I hate to use the word driving, right? Because I think people have agency, right? But the things that make movement to the United States compelling, or more compelling than staying home.
So the agency is a really important element here. There are many people who feel they don't have agency, and that's why they have to leave, because they don't have anything to bind them to their community. In fact, they have, you're right, I mean, we fall into buzzwords very easily, but what this boils down to is that there is, in many cases, there's a variety of causes, a variety of factors. So you can't say that there's one single reason that people pick up and move. It's important to understand that there are, in many parts of Central America, there's a culture of migration, just as there is in Mexico, just as there is within Central America, from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, from northern Guatemala to southern Mexico. And there are entire villages and entire towns across Central America where it's a rite of passage to go to the United States and work, and then maybe return home or maybe not. And typically, these are very well-established patterns. The difference now is the scale and the kind of the breadth of who is picking up and leaving. And certainly the pandemic was a significant part of why we saw this mass movement now. There's something else that you mentioned at the beginning, that historically what we've had when we've had waves of migration, it's been one nationality. It's usually something that is displacing or causing, citizens from a certain part of Mexico, or maybe a certain part of Brazil, to go to a certain part of the United States because there's a connection. Usually it's a family connection and a job connection, and that's all very true today. It's still a part of the pattern, but I think that what has changed is that the number of people traveling at one time, the fact that what we see here in the United States in that kind of mass movement is true across the region. We're seeing very significant displacement for a variety of reasons. And I can list a few of them because it's important to understand just how much is at play here. Climate change is a major factor. People are losing their livelihoods, especially in lucrative cash crops like coffee, and as well as in subsistence farming. People are losing their way of life and being effectively forced off the land and then forced to work in an urban environment where they're not able to find work. And they always have a connection to the United States. As I said, these are societies in many ways more interwoven with the United States than they are with each other. In trade terms, in political terms even, the connections are really with counterparts with family in the United States, less than with family and counterparts in other parts of Central America or Mexico. That's the nature of the patterns over the last 40 years that are now really quite significant in terms of how they touch societies. The other thing that's happened, I mentioned the pandemic, it's important because the most severely affected part of the economies in most of the Americas was the informal sector. People who live not in the formal sector, not in formal jobs, but live on the edges of the economy. Sometimes they're doing quite well. When the economy is doing well, some informal jobs can be really quite lucrative. But when times are tough, money tends to congregate in the formal economy, tends to concentrate in the formal economy, and people on those margins lose. And in Honduras, for example, 70% of the labor force is in the informal sector.
Wow.
So that's important to understand too. The other thing that's happened is that in Central America, these are not small countries. When we think about that movement, somebody arriving at the southwest border might be driven by a variety of things. The biggest single connecting factor is opportunity. There is the economic factor, and the chance to do better is something that seems, it's obvious. The logic for many people is to travel, is to take the risk and come to the United States. It tends to work out for many people. It's hard. It is dangerous, usually more than they expect. But for many people, it is still very much worth it, which presents a challenge because we want Central America to be successful, not just because we want to contend with mass migration, but because just in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, that's 32 million people. That's not small.
Right.
And again, these are not small countries. You want stability. You want there to be for a variety of reasons, you want countries that are that close to the United States to be successful. And migration is just an effect of that lack of success.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the different mechanisms that the United States has tried to use in order to create opportunity. Right. So I remember during the Clinton administration, there was I think, rather explicit acknowledgement that NAFTA would be in part not just trade policy, but it would be migration policy, because it would be a mechanism to provide opportunities for people in Mexico to find higher paying jobs. If we look at the Obama administration, there was an emphasis on foreign aid. And I remember towards the end of Obama's second term, then Vice President Biden had responsibility for this Alliance for Prosperity that was designed to distribute foreign aid dollars. And then Donald Trump administration comes along and stops aid and says, we're going to try and deal with the demand for entry by trying to penalize it. But we're going to try and deter it through building a wall, through increased enforcement. Can you just kind of talk about, from your perspective, both in government and at the Wilson Center where you're observing this, where things fall short, right? Where might aid work and where might aid not work? Where might trade relations work and not work? What about, how do we package this with border security? Is that necessary? Again, big kind of question, but there's so many different kinds of responses that have been going on since the Clinton administration.
So I think you're right to point to NAFTA as intended to. It was a different version of what the European Union tried to do with new entrants there. They used what they called cohesion funds. There they used direct financing, direct budget support to try to improve social conditions in parts of Europe that were new to the Union. It was very successful. We don't have that in the Americas. That wasn't a tool that we had available. The scale is quite different. So what we tried to do through NAFTA was create, basically help generate wealth in Mexico in a way that people would want to stay, but that would also be beneficial to the U.S. economy, and indeed it was. Despite all of the displacement that happened because of it, despite all of those things, all the negatives around NAFTA are true and accurate in many cases, but it's also true that it became an engine for growth in the United States. It did. It created many jobs in the United States in the manufacturing sector, in the ag sector. And in Central America, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement with Central America and the Dominican Republic, was intended to build on other trade facilitation arrangements, like going back to the 1980s and the Caribbean Basin Initiative and other efforts to try to generate improved economic growth. It's really obvious that aid is not up to the job of creating the kind of social development that Central America needs to see. Well, that can only happen through economic growth, and it can't happen just through the kind of economic growth that we've seen, because on paper, Guatemala is quite successful. You wouldn't know that if you were in northern Guatemala in the highlands. It is two countries. And so our approach is to try to generate broad-based growth that reaches the excluded parts of society, that reaches that informal sector. And that's extremely difficult to engineer as an outsider. We believed that the most important factors to try to help bring about that broad-based growth was to focus on governance. That is, so that you had governments that were accountable and had where corruption was more difficult for public officials and for private actors that were trying to take advantage of government, so that the funds would be available, and also so that governments would be motivated to improve conditions for people, as opposed to improving conditions for a few people, and which is unfortunately a long part of the history. And so you had, but the other important factor in governance was, did they have the right sort of incentives in place for people to just do business and to help bring those, like large companies do fine in Central America. It's the small and medium enterprises that suffer. And the other factor, surprisingly, I think for many people, is that multinationals have actually, in many cases, been a positive force in terms of helping bring certain parts of the economy into the kind of formal supply chains and improving conditions for at least some people. In agriculture, for example, that there are companies, multinational companies that source food and other materials locally and require those suppliers to be in the formal chain, and they give them the capacity to do that. Why is that? In the case of U.S. companies, it's because they're subject to oversight and laws, and basically they're liable, right? There's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, makes sure that they're not involved in corrupt practices and getting certain benefits. Shareholders have to worry about the company being sued if it has forced labor as part of the supply chain. So those things are actually an enormous force for good, and a part of the reason why we've chosen to focus on economic development and governance really as the core areas of work. Not just dealing with individual cases of corruption, but trying to go at systemic approaches that are going to help generate longer term growth. I mean, I have to say, this has been very difficult, and we've had some successes, but on the whole, this is a game of perceptions, and the perception in Central America is that things are continuing to go very badly.
So, following up on this, I remember reading, I guess it was January, when Vice President Harris announced, I think it was a $4 billion plan to, it was a public-private partnership, right, in terms of $4 billion invested in the countries of the Northern Triangle. I read in one article that I think that there had been an express mention of Nespresso, for example, that was going to partner, I think, with a small agricultural entity. I think it was in Guatemala, could have been Honduras. But can you talk a little bit more about the nature of this of the government trying to incentivize, or maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, the U.S. government trying to encourage private sector investment? What sorts of, again, I don't want to say strings, right? But I'm wondering, like, what's the nature of that relationship in terms of trying to incentivize these multinationals to invest in areas where, as you've said, the perception of good governance just doesn't exist?
Right. So what we try to do is, I think in 2014, one of the things that we found was that we put too much of our success rested on political will in Central America. And so what we tried to do was develop a plan that didn't rely on political will, but rather on incentives, political incentives. Everybody wants to be responsible for job growth. Everybody wants to say that they delivered a certain number of jobs to their population, maybe even especially leaders that are maybe more autocratic or leaning in that direction. They need to have some sort of benefit that they're providing. And the basic premise was that we could bring together companies and say that we would be willing to help create the conditions where they could invest if governments were willing to take the necessary steps to allow that investment to go forward. Essentially, it's about providing judicial certainty, establishing rule of law, preventing corruption, making sure that they could hire a workforce, the kind of workforce they needed. In other words, incentivizing training, incentivizing education, incentivizing transparent infrastructure improvements. Some of the greatest areas of corruption are around import-export, around ports, around infrastructure development. So we tried to put conditionality on our incentivizing this kind of investment. It is a very much an imperfect science. If you'll forgive me 1 second, though, it's not without some success.
Yeah, there you go. So is it an Nespresso ad, I guess? This
is the first Nespresso package from Honduras.
That's great.
So this is the first coffee. And one of the interesting things about that particular company is that they work directly with farmers. And they cut out where a lot of the loss happens, which is among the intermediaries in the manufacturing process for coffee. They, without a requirement that farmers sell their product to Nespresso, they provide technical assistance. They help them access markets they might not be able to access. Again, they think that's good for business, and they target areas where there's high quality coffee. In Central America, there's lots of sources of very high quality coffee, but it's difficult to market, and it's not a huge profit margin. So they try to bring some of that to incentivize. And for us, it's small scale. This is not going to be what turns the tide, but it's an example of the kind of trade that we think over time is going to be more likely to yield longer term benefits there. So that's what we want to incentivize companies that are committed to transparency, committed to good governance, and are able to play a role in national economies that are going to be increasingly important, to kind of try to basically squeeze out actors that operate on the margins of the law.
So to take the Nespresso example, and again, not to get too much into the weeds, but from the top of the treetops, would the Nespresso example be one where we would hope that where would the Biden administration and you would hope that Nespresso would require that the farmers that they're working with hire people in the formal sector so that they move out of informal sector hiring?
So they help people be able to cross that threshold.
Okay.
And that they basically are, the idea is that they are providing a higher quality of employment to attract people, and through that, they're able, through their suppliers, to give them the means to enter the formal sector and to continue to succeed as small and medium enterprises. That's the idea. Yeah. But the other thing, and just to be completely clear, the other thing is larger companies that aren't doing that are providing a large number of jobs are also important. It's better to have high quality jobs that are bringing people out of the informal sector. It's also important to have people who are creating jobs. And politically, for the United States, we don't incentivize jobs that are taking jobs from the United States. And so it also has to be, our niche is creating jobs that also help create jobs in the United States. That's what not just our politics, but the law requires. And that's how, that means that there's not just sort of unlimited space to develop anything. It's got to be the right combination of factors.
Right. Now, it's fascinating. Let me just remind folks who are watching online that they can type questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to move away from the northern triangle of Central America as a source of migration, and think about that area and Mexico as well as a zone of transit, right? So one of the things that we've been observing at least since September of last year is the number of arrivals on the southern border from countries outside of the Northern Triangle, and indeed outside of South America, have increased. At the same time, I've been watching both with fascination and with horror the stories that are coming out of the Darien Gap, right? And looking at that region as an area of high trafficking of people, of drugs, of weapons, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the way in which your work and the Central America, Northern Central America portfolio is impacted by or intersects with patterns of mobility that we're seeing coming through South America.
So I must have followed that pattern, because in the summer it was when I took on this other responsibility for being responsible for the whole region, just as we started to see that occur. I hope I'm not to blame, but the fact is, you're exactly right. What we saw beginning in June and then really skyrocketing in September and October is movement from certainly Venezuelan, Haitian, Ecuadorian, Brazilian, and not Brazilian migrants from traditional areas, but from areas that had not been seen a lot of migration in the past. Colombians, Nicaraguans are now one of the largest groups coming to the United States, which historically they've gone to Costa Rica. Right. And there's many reasons for it. One is a perception that the U.S. border was permeable, easy to cross, and that you would be given status in the United States. Another was just the fact that, and this is really important, the smuggling has a lot of different facets. There are all kinds of travelers. There are very high quality ones that are sort of the Cadillac version of the migrant smuggling, where you are guaranteed you do this by air and you're on air-conditioned bus to the southwest border. That's one. That's not what most people experience. Most people have some version of the Darien Gap. And so we started to see these incredible movements of charter flights to be able to skip over Panama and avoid that, land somewhere in Central America and go from there. We saw this with a whole range of nationalities. Again, we were trying to catch up to trends as they were developing. And a lot of this was because there were populations that were displaced during the pandemic that we had no idea were planning on picking up and leaving. But the other thing is, and this we heard, I remember a Brazilian official describing to me how a smuggling organization that specialized in Central America, within a week of us tightening border controls in Central America with Mexico, switched gears and started advertising flights for Brazilians from different parts of Brazil, and using social media and with the same advertising that they used, and it was highly, highly effective. And so they were able to move tens of thousands of people from Brazil into Mexico by air, and you're always behind public demand. And again, what you're trying to impede is sort of this human logic. These are people who are responding rationally to the circumstances. And what we're trying to do is change the calculus. And the real impact that this had was in October, we realized that this was a phenomenon that was affecting not just the United States, but you had movements in every direction around the Americas. We had, at the time that we were seeing as many as 7,000 people a day arriving at the U.S. southwest border, 500 people a day were arriving at the Chilean northern border, and mostly Venezuelans. But you saw this repeated in country after country after country. There were camps in Colombia that had never existed before. There were parts of Ecuador that were saturated with people moving back and forth. It affected everybody. So we held an event to essentially declare this to be a common problem, and to look at solutions that focused on providing protection for vulnerable migrants that were passing through the region, ensuring that people there is always a percentage of those populations that are seeking asylum, that aren't going for reasons. They're fleeing gender-based violence, they're fleeing political persecution, they're fleeing from criminal organizations. All of these things are real. So another area of focus has been working with the International Organization of Migration, with the UN, with UN agencies in general, but also with national agencies to try to stand up protection agencies across the region. And there's a lot of support for that because the reality is that the history of migration is one where for long it was considered a basic right in most of Latin America. That has changed as Latin America has become more of a destination. But at the same time, there's still this deep culture of wanting to have a humanitarian response, as almost every country has done that to some degree. It's just that the means are very limited for the most part, and so there are still really terrible cases. I would say also, and this is something that we raise a lot, when you see mass movements from Afghanistan, from within Africa and from Africa, from Central Asia toward Europe, within the Middle East, obviously, Syrian displacement and so forth, there is usually a massive international response to go with that. This huge international migration has all been, the response to it's all been resourced out of national budgets with very, very limited international support.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point, and I think let's make sure we come back to that as when we close and talk about the comparison between Central America and what we're observing in the Ukraine. But yes. Before we get there, I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of your last answer, when you're talking about when you took this job and when your portfolio expanded over the summer, and we saw an increased number of people from a broader set of countries. And you said, in part, this might have been a reflection of, and I think these are your words, the perception that the southern border is permeable. There's a question that came in online that asks, what would you say to those who argue that the Biden administration has exacerbated the nation's immigration challenges?
So I would say, I think the most important thing is this. There was massive pent-up demand in the region for people who are trying to get to the United States. I would say also one of the largest migration spikes in the history of the country was in 2019, when we had our highest level of enforcement. That was the most desperate contingent, but we still had, it was one of the largest spikes we've ever seen. When you see, we've looked hard at this, and so I'm going to step back because one thing I will absolutely say is that there is this perception that there is more, that it is a more permissive environment that is more welcoming for migrants. A lot of that is there is hardly a step that the United States takes that is not misconstrued deliberately by people who are trying to create basically by smugglers who are trying to make money off of this. And so when they see an opportunity, basically everything you do, border tightening means that they say you must rush to get this to go now before the border gets tight. In fact, that's what we saw in 2019. That's what led to this massive spike, was news that the enforcement was going to intensify. And so everyone rushed at once. But understand where we are. As I said, 32 million people just in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. There are 6 million people displaced from Venezuela, most of whom are in South America, most of whom have been taken in by just 3 countries, by Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia especially. You have massive displacement, including in South America, of Haitian nationals, Cubans, Colombians. The combination of the pandemic, the pent-up demand, and here I think the most important piece is, and the U.S. economy, which is booming in comparison to most of the region, these are all factors. When you look historically at when migration has increased, the pattern between U.S. economic growth and high levels of migration is very stark. We have to understand too, it's not policy, it's not, very often, it's not policy, it's not messaging, it's just need and opportunity that lead people to leave. The number of people displaced economically right now is the highest in the history of the region. The number of people displaced, period, is the highest in the history of the Americas. So I would say that there's a huge range of factors. You also have to approach this with a degree of humility and understand that there are factors that are beyond the control of any single government to manage, and you have to respond to those and put in place public policies that are going to actually attend to people's needs. We also have a couple of other basic factors. One is that the U.S. immigration system is absolutely broken. The laws do not attend to either the intent or the spirit of what Congress wants to accomplish through our immigration system. They're not attuned to benefit the United States economically in the way that Congress would like to see them do. We have the family-based petition system is not efficient and is experiencing major backlogs. And most of all, we have enormous difficulty in separating people who have a legal claim to asylum from people who don't. And that is because of the basically U.S. laws, which have proven very, very difficult to change. So this is that's a reality that we deal with constantly, and that mostly falls to our colleagues in the Department of Homeland Security, but certainly affects the Department of State and is one of the biggest challenges that we have in front of us.
No, I appreciate you hitting on all of those different dimensions and really emphasizing the fact that we have a 19th century immigration system that's being applied in the 21st century. But part of that also, I think, is it's reinforced by, this is my opinion, the continuation of Title 42, as a public health policy. And let me just for those who are unfamiliar with it. So Title 42 was implemented by the Trump administration in March of 2020, and it basically is a pronouncement that came from the CDC that allows the border patrol to keep people out who have passed through a country that is having a public health emergency. I may have over summarized it, but the Biden administration. The Biden administration, in again, my personal opinion, I was surprised that they continued to enforce Title 42, although a little bit differently than the Trump administration did, but it is still enforced. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why it is still enforced and what the utility of that policy response is.
So there's a number of factors. I think the one is that in fact, there is a particularly recalling that it remained in force at a time before there were vaccines or before we knew how we were going to, how we were going to contend with the pandemic, period. There were very high levels of infection. It was affecting communities. So there was a real element that connected to the pandemic itself. There's a couple of other important factors. The first is that the system for conducting what you would call regular screening under Title 42 is this one that allows for the removal of people. Essentially, you don't reach the U.S. immigration system under Title 42.
Right.
You're kept apart from the U.S. immigration system for legal purposes. The normal system, the regular system that falls under Title 8, which is what you think of historically. Somebody comes to the border, they either claim that they have they present some kind of claim to being able to get into the United States. They're being persecuted, or that's the most typical one. There's a few other limited options there, or they don't. And they're not able to demonstrate that they have that claim, and they're deported. deportations on the spot don't really happen. I mean, that's something you have to go through. There's a very well-established process for making that happen. Two things. One is the number of people coming now. There is no system in place that is built for 7,500 people a day arriving at the U.S. Southwest border. That just doesn't exist. That's one thing. Title 42 was, I think, continued in part to be able to, it was a reflection of that was a tool that was used and available to prevent the system that exists from being overwhelmed. That's one factor. The other factor is that those tools, those elements that supported Title VIII enforcement, so immigration judges, asylum screeners, facilities where families could be safely held, that was in tatters, both because of the pandemic, but also because of policies under the last administration. The legal system had been substantially degraded, really very significantly degraded. And under those circumstances, DHS was very poorly placed to contend with it. But I should emphasize here, Title 42 is temporary. It always was going to be temporary. There are multiple legal challenges to it. We live in the world of legal reality. This is not some sort of permanent system. This is going to end. And so behind the scenes, the effort has been to try to rebuild and dedicate the right number of immigration judges and asylum screeners and have the physical space to be able to do that safely. Hopefully the pandemic we're going through a period where that's going to be, we can do that. But remember, we're talking about spaces where you hold many people together, families together. It gets really dangerous. And if you're not able to do the Title VIII system efficiently, you're going to have the exact same pull, what we call a pull factor. People will say, in fact, there's no reason to delay going because you're never going to be stopped. And then that sort of perpetuates the cycle. David, it's a really important question, one that we wrestle with because we also are very uncomfortable with it. We've never liked, it's always been subject to intense legal scrutiny for a reason. And so it is challenging and something we're trying to get past, but it is an extraordinary moment across the region. And so we're also cognizant of the fact that if there's a pull signal in the United States, that affects every country south of us, because then you have people moving through. And so Mexico also has a very deep stake in making sure that we have a good, strong legal process. And so all of this is negotiated with Mexico because they also have to take care of their enforcement, but also their immigration laws, which increasingly are modeled on ours in terms of providing protections and increasingly aimed at protecting, in particular, children, which in turn draws people from Central America who think they're going to get certain benefits. So this is a really complex problem.
Yeah. I think, do we have a question from the audience? No? Okay, so tell you what, think about, if you all have a question, think about it. I have one more kind of big question for Ricardo to chew on. And I'm wondering if you can take a step back from the Northern Triangle and from the Western Hemisphere. You know, I think probably you and certainly me, you know, even though I spend most of my time focusing on the Western Hemisphere, I've been glued to, you know, the Twitter feed that's following displacements coming out of Ukraine, right? And thinking about and looking at the response from Poland, Germany, et cetera. And so I'm just going to ask you if you can take a step back and tell me from your perspective, both as somebody who's a policymaker, but also somebody who works in policy, how does what's happening in the Ukraine influence your work in an existential sense and then in a very real sense?
It absolutely does. And let's set migration aside for a moment, because there is an implication there. The shorthand for it is the more that we dedicate international resources to attend to that mass migration out of Ukraine, the fewer resources there are going to be for the rest of the world. There's a finite resource for that. So that is going to have an implication. But let's step back for a second. Even, I would say most importantly, and I say this objectively, this was an extraordinary moment of American diplomacy. This is what we do as an agency. These moments are why we exist. And the fact is that it is rare to have such a clear instance of a violation of the international order and international peace as what we've seen in the Ukraine. I've never seen the United States use intelligence in this way ahead of an invasion or ahead of an act like this to try to create this public narrative in the way that people understand. I don't want to overstate that. It's Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine, and most of the story really is about what Ukrainians are doing. So I don't want to overstate our role. But I can tell you this, if it hadn't been for U.S. diplomacy and the personal engagement of the diplomatic and political leadership of the United States, working with Europe, working with Canada, working with our NATO partners, working with Japan, working with a lot of countries that are more skeptical of the United States, but that also have a stake in international stability. I just saw now the UN General Assembly had a vote where there was one of the largest, most lopsided votes I've ever seen at the UN General Assembly. And countries that are very close to Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, they abstained. China abstained because, again, in the diplomatic sense, it was crystal clear who was the aggressor in this and who was the victim. And that hardly ever happens in the international arena. And in fact, there's Russia will make the argument that that's not the case. This is the result of years of encirclement and hostility by NATO. But what is happening today, it is crystal clear to everyone exactly what is happening, and that this is it's a war of aggression, and it's a territorial war, and it's the kind of thing that was supposed to be over in Europe. And so that's why you see all these switches flip in terms of where countries' postures regarding not just Russia, but international security in Europe. For the United States, this is also a rare instance of there being a real alignment between countries that are more autocratic and countries that lean towards. It's not simple, as simple as that. There's more gray, but in general terms, this really fits into this massive struggle that the United States is in this fight between autocracy and democracy. What it really boils down to, we are very much in that struggle, and this is probably the most emblematic moment. This is a hinge in European history and probably in American history as well. And I will say, again, in 29 years that I've been doing this, I've never seen this level of thinking ahead and coordination, understanding that we have a horrible war, and where the outcome is most likely to result in unfortunately many more civilian deaths than what we've seen, and where you could see, there's no guarantee that this is going to turn out the way the first few days have gone, which seemed like a setback for Russia. But we're in a very dangerous moment, and we're just not used to being in that world. So it's a really important moment for us, and really the end in many ways of the post-Cold War era, the beginning of something else.
Wow, that's pretty powerful words to digest and think about. I was going to ask you if you have any concluding thoughts, but that sounds like a pretty powerful way to conclude our time together. So let me just thank you so much for taking the time and you being forthright and transparent about answering some of these questions. I think these are politically important. I think they're important for humanitarian reasons. I approach them as an academic, and so academically, I think these are powerfully important and interesting questions. And just, again, I can't thank you enough for coming back virtually to Grounds and spending some time with us.
Look, I'm delighted to be here. I would just say I owe so much to the University of Virginia. I am now in my 29th year in the Foreign Service. And I began because I had an internship opportunity through the University of Virginia with the Department of State. It was not, I was a foreign affairs major, but I had not really thought about the Department of State as a career option. And it's because of the really incredible experiences that I had there. So I go back as regularly as I can. I've missed it during the pandemic, but my heart is still very much in Charlottesville. So I'm glad to be able to participate in this. And thank you so much for inviting me, David. I think that these were great questions and really the same ones that we ask at the highest levels here. This is just really important for the country in terms of what we're seeing. But I think it's also very timely, and these are things that demand real inspection.
Yeah. Well, again, I can't wait to have another opportunity to chat with you. I feel like we've really just skimmed the surface of some really deep and powerful questions. Let me also thank those of you at home for joining us from wherever you are at home, and thank again our very first studio audience in 2 years here at the Miller Center. We hope that there will be many more opportunities to welcome more and more of you back to grounds. Special Envoy Zuniga, thank you again for taking the time, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.